Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really significant issue that's rapidly coming into focus: the enormous energy needs of artificial intelligence.
Yeah,
We've
absolutely.
gathered a bunch of articles that don't just, throw numbers at us, but really dig into what this energy consumption actually means for the future.
Right. And this isn't some niche technical detail, is it? It feels much more fundamental, uh, influencing the economy, our environment, maybe even global politics.
Exactly. And it all seemed to kick off, or at least get major attention, with that statement from Sam Altman at OpenAI, talking about needing small modular nuclear reactors just to power AI.
hmm
Is that just hyperbole, a grabby headline, or is there something real behind it? Okay, let's try and unpack this.
Well, there's definitely substance there, I think. To really get a handle on it, we kind of need to split it in two.
Okay.
There's the energy used when an AI model is being developed, the training phase, they call it. And then there's the energy it uses when it's actually doing tasks for you, the operational side.
Ah, right. Like teaching someone versus them actually doing the job.
Exactly. Think of it like teaching a kid to read versus the energy they use reading a book later. That initial learning. Huge effort. Immense. But once they know how, the energy for each book is much smaller. Though, obviously, it adds up if they read all the time.
That makes perfect sense. And that training phase, from what I've read, that's where the real energy intensity lies, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah.
I saw an estimate from 2022 for training GPT-3. It was around 1,300 megawatt hours.
That's the figure, yeah.
Now, to put that in perspective for you listening, that's enough electricity to power about 130 average U.S. homes
Well,
for an entire year.
And remember, AI models have only gotten bigger and, well, way more complex since 2022.
Much bigger. So that number's probably gone up significantly.
Almost certainly. And what's fascinating here, or maybe alarming, is the sheer financial cost this implies.
Right, the money side.
Estimates suggest training something like GPT-4 could have cost upwards of $100 million, maybe more.
$100 million. Wow.
And that price tag, well, it basically creates this huge barrier, doesn't it?
Mm.
It means only organizations with truly massive resources can even play in this league, developing these cutting-edge models.
Which has big implications for who controls this stuff.
Definitely. That concentration of power, it really matters for where AI development goes.
And that sort of brings to mind that whole lawsuit drama between Elon Musk and OpenAI, right? It might look like just Silicon Valley infighting, but it really throws a spotlight on the colossal amounts of capital being poured into this race for advanced AI.
It really does. I mean, OpenAI themselves have apparently said they expect to need billions of dollars every year to develop artificial general intelligence, AGI.
Billions a year, that's staggering.
And if you connect the dots, that lawsuit and everything around it, it really highlights OpenAI's shift, from a nonprofit research idea to a major for-profit player.
That shift was partly because of these costs, wasn't it?
Precisely. They saw the staggering computational costs coming down the line. Musk leaving, Microsoft jumping in with huge investments. It just underlines the massive financial stakes.
Okay, so that's the enormous energy bill and the cash just for creating these AI giants. But what about when you and I are just using them day to day, typing a question into a chatbot or asking it to generate an image?
Yeah, the operational side. So there's a preprint study, important to note it's not peer-reviewed yet, from Hugging Face and Carnegie Mellon University. It gives us some interesting figures.
Okay, what did they find?
For text-based tasks, like asking a question, their estimates suggest it's relatively low energy, maybe a few milliwatt hours per task, or a few watt hours for every 1,000 tasks you run.
A few watt hours per 1,000. Okay, that doesn't sound too bad on its own, but I remember the sources saying image generation is a whole different ballgame.
Exactly right. Generating images is significantly more energy intensive. We're talking maybe a few watt hours for one single image.
A few watt hours per image, that's quite a jump.
It is. And the comparison they made in one source was pretty telling. Generating just one AI image can use roughly the same amount of energy as fully charging your smartphone.
Charging your whole phone battery for one picture.
Okay, so yeah, if you imagine billions of people doing that regularly, that energy demand could definitely start to climb fast.
Okay, so how does all this AI energy use, both training and operation, fit into the bigger picture, like data center energy use overall?
That's where the International Energy Agency, the IEA, gives us some really crucial context. Right now, data centers, and remember, they power everything, not just AI, but the whole internet.
Yeah.
Basically, they account for about 1 to 2% of global electricity consumption.
1 to 2% globally. How much is that in real terms?
It's around 400 terawatt hours per year. which is, get this, roughly equivalent to the total annual energy consumption of the entire United Kingdom.
The entire UK. Wow. Okay, that really puts it in perspective. And what are the projections? Where's this heading?
Well, the IEA projects that this demand from data centers could more than double.
Double. By when?
By 2026, so pretty soon.
Wow.
And this projected increase, it's expected to be largely fueled by, you guessed it, the growing demands of AI applications, alongside things like crypto mining, which are still humming along.
So even if my individual chatbot question seems tiny, multiply it billions of times, add image generation, add the training, it leads to this potentially massive spike in overall data center energy demand.
That seems to be the consensus, yeah.
But are people trying to make AI itself more efficient? Are there efforts to cut down this energy use?
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of work going into specialized hardware. Computer chips designed specifically for AI calculations.
Right, dedicated chips.
And that dedicated hardware can be much more energy efficient than using general-purpose processors for these tasks. Plus, there are these interesting examples like DeepMind working with Google, using AI itself to optimize things.
How so?
Like optimizing the cooling systems in the data centers,
Yeah.
making them run more efficiently to save power.
Huh, that's a neat feedback loop. Using AI to make AI's home more efficient.
It is pretty clever. However, the overall feeling is that total energy consumption linked to AI is still expected to rise a lot.
Despite the efficiencies.
Despite the efficiencies, simply because the sheer scale and complexity of AI deployment is expected to grow so massively, it'll likely swamp the efficiency gains.
So circling back, Altman's comment about needing new power sources, maybe even nuclear, it starts to sound less like a crazy sci-fi idea and more like, well, a potential necessity they're seriously considering?
It seems that way, yes, to meet these projected demands.
Okay, so we've looked at the raw energy numbers, the terawatt hours, but one of our sources kind of hinted that maybe the amount of energy isn't even the biggest hurdle. What were they getting at?
Yeah, that was an interesting angle. The source suggested that the cost implications might actually be even more critical than the absolute kilowatt hours consumed.
The cost? How so?
Well, building and operating these huge cutting-edge AI models is just incredibly expensive. We mentioned the $100 million training cost earlier. The ongoing operation isn't free either. This could realistically lead to a future where only, say, a handful of the biggest tech companies, or maybe some very well-funded governments, can actually afford to own and run the most powerful AI systems.
Right, a sort of AI oligarchy.
You could put it that way. And that raises some really serious questions about who gets access to this potentially transformative technology, doesn't it?
It really does. What does that mean for the rest of us?
Well, it could mean that most individuals, maybe even many smaller countries or companies, might end up just renting access. Paying subscriptions to use AI services controlled by these few major players.
And the cost of those subscriptions could then become a major barrier itself.
Exactly. Potentially limiting who can afford to use the most powerful AI tools, widen digital divides, maybe even hindering innovation if access isn't broad.
So you're talking about potentially gatekeeping access to things like major scientific breakthroughs, using AI to find cures for diseases or crack fundamental physics problems, that kind of thing.
It's a possibility you have to consider. If the computing power needed is locked behind prohibitively high costs, it could definitely create disparities in who benefits from those breakthroughs. It's a really sobering thought.
Yeah, it is. And this sort of leads us to another critical resource that came up in the sources, something I hadn't really thought about much in this context. Water.
Ah, yes. Water consumption. It's surprisingly crucial.
Water. How does water tie into AI and data centers so significantly?
Well, think about it. You have these massive buildings packed full of servers all running constantly, generating a tremendous amount of heat.
Right. They must get incredibly hot.
Incredibly. And one of the primary ways to cool them down to stop the equipment from overheating and failing is using water, pumping water through cooling systems.
Okay, but the articles mention some staggering figures. Google, in 2023, used water equivalent to, what was it, 1/18 of Lake Athabasca.
That was the comparison used, yeah. Just for cooling its data centers. Let that sink in.
Yeah.
That's a truly enormous volume of water.
It really is hard to picture.
And Microsoft's, another huge player here, their freshwater consumption for data centers jumped 34% in just 1 year, hitting nearly 8 million cubic meters in 2022.
A 34% increase in 1 year.
Yeah. And they've even made moves, as mentioned in the sources, looking into restarting dormant nuclear reactors, like part of the 3 Mile Island facility, not just for the grid, but specifically get the reliable power their AI data centers need.
So these nuclear plans aren't just abstract energy policy, they're being directly linked to powering AI infrastructure itself. That's quite a development.
It seems to be a direct link they're acknowledging, yes.
And the cooling process, it's basically just constantly flushing huge amounts of clean water through these systems to dissipate heat.
That's the basic mechanism, yeah. And critically, it often needs to be fresh water, clean water, because using water with too many impurities could cause corrosion or mineral buildup on the sensitive equipment.
So they're drawing on freshwater sources, the same water we need for drinking, for agriculture.
Exactly. And it's not just the sheer volume, it's where these data centers are often built, sometimes in regions where water is already scarce.
Creating competition for local water resources?
Direct competition, potentially. Straining local supplies, impacting communities, ecosystems. It's a very real physical footprint beyond just the energy lines.
One article even tried to break it down to individual use, didn't it? Something like 10 to 55 prompts on ChatGPT using about half a liter of fresh water.
That was an estimate cited, yes. Half a liter, maybe a standard water bottle's worth for a handful of interactions.
Individually, that seems tiny, negligible almost. But again, scale it up. Millions or billions of users, billions of prompts.
It becomes a really substantial demand very quickly. And the sources gave actual examples of this causing friction. Amazon's plans in Santiago, Chile, a water-stressed city, faced huge local opposition.
Right, I remember reading that. And Google in Oregon.
The Dallas, Oregon, yeah. Reports suggested their data centers there were consuming something like a quarter of the entire city's water supply.
A quarter of the city's water. Wow.
And there was an estimate that a typical mid-sized data center can use maybe 300,000 gallons of water per day.
Per day? How much is that?
Equivalent to the daily water use of roughly 100,000 homes.
Okay. These numbers really do start to paint a picture of a technology with a very significant resource footprint. Energy and water.
Indeed. And this growing thirst for both reliable power and vast amounts of water is a key reason why big tech is increasingly looking towards nuclear power. That was the focus of our third source.
Right, the nuclear angle. The stat that really jumped out at me there was the comparison between a ChatGPT query and a Google search. That a single ChatGPT query could use something like 10 times more electricity than a standard Google search.
Yeah, that comparison seems to have been a real wake-up call for many. A concrete example of the step change in energy intensity with these generative AI models.
So that kind of jump in power demand from AI, plus other trends like electrification, manufacturing coming back on shore, it's pushing nuclear back into the serious conversation, isn't it?
It really is, especially when you consider the limitations of renewables like solar and wind. They're crucial, obviously, but they aren't always generating power.
They're intermittent. You need something for the baseload, the 247 power.
Exactly. And nuclear offers that. Consistent, 247, and importantly, emissions-free electricity at the point of generation.
And the articles detailed some pretty major moves by the big tech players. Amazon signing power purchase agreements, even buying land next to nuclear plants.
Microsoft partnering with Constellation Energy, looking at potentially reviving parts of 3 Mile Island specifically for data centers.
Google investing in advanced reactor designs with Kairos power. Even Meta, apparently, exploring options. It feels like a coordinated push.
It certainly looks like a strategic recognition by these companies. They have this grand vision for an AI-powered future, right? And they clearly understand that making that vision a reality absolutely depends on having access to huge amounts of clean, reliable energy. Nuclear power seems to fit that bill, aligning with sustainability goals while meeting the sheer scale of the demand.
And there's a lot of buzz around small modular reactors, SMRs. What's the deal with those? Why are they particularly relevant here?
SMRs have a few potential advantages that make them appealing. First, they're smaller than traditional massive nuclear plants.
Right, small's in the name.
Which means they could potentially be faster to build, maybe less capital intensive upfront compared to a gigawatt scale plant. Their modular design is also key.
Modular, meaning?
Meaning components can be built in a factory setting, standardized, and then assembled on site. Theoretically, that could streamline construction, maybe lower costs, improve quality control.
So instead of building a huge plant, you could maybe install smaller units as needed, more scalable.
That's the idea. A traditional large reactor might be around a gigawatt, maybe more. An SMR is typically talked about in the range of, say, up to 300 megawatts. So yeah, potentially more flexible for meeting incremental growth in demand, like from new data centers.
Okay, sounds promising. More flexible, maybe faster, maybe cheaper. But The sources pointed out some significant catches, didn't they?
Oh, definitely. It's not a simple solution yet. A crucial point is that there aren't actually any SMRs currently operational in the United States.
Not at all.
Not yet. They're still in development and demonstration phases. And the regulatory approval process for any new nuclear design, especially SMRs, is complex and could still face significant hurdles and delays.
So when are we realistically likely to see these SMRs deployed in the U.S.?
Most projections seem to point towards the 2030s, maybe later. It's not an immediate fix.
Right. And even for established nuclear tech, the idea of restarting old plants, like 3 Mile Island, that's kind of new territory too, isn't it?
It really is. Reviving previously decommissioned plants brings its own unique engineering challenges, safety reviews, regulatory questions. There isn't really an established playbook for doing that.
And we also have to remember the history here, the public perception of nuclear.
Absolutely. There's a strong historical backdrop of public opposition fueled by accidents like Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island itself, Fukushima.
And even before those, a long-standing anti-nuclear movement concerned about weapons, waste, even just the idea of having too much cheap energy, weirdly enough.
That historical context is definitely still relevant and shapes the landscape. However, the tech companies entering this space changes the dynamic somewhat.
How so?
Well, they bring two things: enormous amounts of capital and a very powerful vested self-interest in securing reliable, clean energy for their AI plans. That combination could potentially help overcome some traditional obstacles, maybe shift the public conversation a bit.
It's a powerful incentive. Right now, nuclear is about, what, 20% of the U.S. energy mix?
Around that, yeah.
Yeah.
And projections suggest that share is likely to increase. Data centers and AI are seen as major drivers behind this expected overall jump in U.S. electricity demand, maybe 20% more needed over the next decade alone.
A 20% increase in national electricity demand in 10 years, driven significantly by AI and data centers. That really feels like we're at a turning point for our energy system.
It really does feel that way. And that quote, I think it was Altman again, abundant intelligence is largely built on abundant energy.
Yeah.
It cuts right to the heart of it, doesn't it?
Yeah. The future of AI seems fundamentally tied to our ability to generate enough clean, reliable power.
You can't really have one without the other, at scale anyway.
One of the articles even sort of hinted at this possibility of tech investment potentially unlocking a kind of beautiful future powered by abundant clean energy, almost echoing that pre-1970s optimism about technology solving everything.
It's a compelling idea, that vision. A return to that kind of technological optimism, maybe driven by the needs of AI.
But ultimately, I guess it brings us back to a really fundamental question, maybe for you listening, to think about what is the right balance here between the incredible potential benefits that AI might offer, solving huge problems, changing our lives, and its very real, very significant demands on critical resources like energy and water.
Yeah, where do we draw the line? Or how do we manage that trade-off?
And what responsibility do the developers, the tech companies building these things have? And what about us, the users? What role do we play in ensuring that this incredibly powerful technology develops along a sustainable path?
Those are definitely the big, long-term questions that these trends force us to confront. It's something worth pondering as this all unfolds.